Yes. All right. Good. We start the streaming on our end in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session at the TE Academy study season with Shermin, the token design thinking framework. Again, great to have you here on Zoom. For those who are following us on Twitter, you can join the study season program via going to tokenengineering.net, register, and then have full access to the learning material and can even acquire a proof of knowledge NFT. Today, we have the second session in Shermin's program, live track number 1. Happy to see you all again here. And stage is yours, Shermin. Let's kick off the second session.
Wonderful. Thank you again for inviting me and for your patience last time. It was really an intro to Web3 and tokenization and all the definitions of certain terms. So we're all on the same page and we will get a bit more practical today. I will share my screen now. Just give me a second. All right. All right, so today we will look at the step-by-step kind of design thinking framework, the questionnaire, the step-by-step questions that we need to answer when trying to design token systems or trying to analyze existing token systems. Before we deep dive into the step-to-step questionnaire, I would like to recap a little bit what we said last time for all those who might have missed also last time's session, and just also to recall everything. So basically, the way I like to define Web3 tokens, they're like collectively managed web rights management tools. Basically, a token can represent any type of right, not only property rights or ownership rights in the form of assets, but also access right, voting rights, information rights, policy making rights, any type of executive right, etc. And what makes these tokens and this right management systems, we've had them in the analog world and in the digital world, but what makes Web3 tokens obviously unique is that they're publicly verifiable because they're managed by public blockchain networks, by a public infrastructure. So rights in general can be managed in a centralized way, analog or Web2-based systems. This is the last step, last point here on the slide, through non-automated coordination mechanisms or maybe semi-automated coordination mechanisms. But in Web3, we like to talk about, use the word decentralization. Rights are managed in a decentralized way, decentralized referring that it's kind of a distributed set of autonomous network actors automatically coordinate towards the common goal through a fully automated coordination mechanisms. An example is the Bitcoin network, of course, the first example, and the coordination mechanism is proof of work. Since Ethereum, we have seen, because Ethereum made it easy to create decentralized organizations with the smart contracts or a set of smart contracts with a few lines of code, we've seen the emergence of decentralized organizations or Web3 networks where there are like a certain degree of human intervention. So these DAOs, very often they used to be called DAOs. This term has become a bit less popular because it's a bit fuzzy. But these organizations had various degrees of human coordination. So they were only they had partially automated coordination mechanisms, and part of the coordination mechanisms had intentional human intervention. For example, For those who know, for those of you who know MakerDAO, it's a stable token DAO. A lot of the coordination mechanisms for maintaining the stability rate and the peg to the US dollar are based on automated coordination mechanisms, but some mechanisms require human intervention, especially like the security mechanisms, emergency shutdown mechanisms, etc. So rights can be managed fully automated or partially automated or non-automated. And I think this is important. And in Web3, we like to fully or we like to automate what we can in the coordination structure of these new types of organizations. The other thing that we mentioned last time were the types of tokens, depending on what rights are represented by tokens. We can have tokens that represent more, have properties of assets, or that represent any type of certificate or access right. And we also mentioned the incentive tokens that steer DAOs. It's very important to recall that obviously tokens can have different rights attached to them. They can represent a property right, therefore be an asset, but if they are designed to steer a decentralized network like the Bitcoin network, there are also incentive tokens of the network, or what I like to refer to as purpose-driven tokens. And this is where people still in the Web3 community, and more even people who have been in Web3 for longer, often get confused, or it's unclear yet whether, when we design a token, whether this token should represent only one right, such as a property right or an access right or a voting right, or whether we should design different tokens that do different things and represent, each one of them represents different rights, or if one token can represent various rights. And we don't have any best practices yet. And this is why people often get confused and do meme-based token design. And in order not to do that, we have today's session. So please kind of be aware that we're still, even though you might have been in Web3 for a few years now, I think we're still in the Wild West ages or stages of Web3. And yes, many men back then, and still many men back in Web3, although we have the occasional women and other identities. But this is not the main topic here. So what we said last time also was that asset tokens are the first cohort of tokens that have emerged in Web3. It's the type of tokens that most people understand. They represent currencies, whether they're virtual currencies or real currencies that have a digital Web3-based twin, assets that represent any type of non-fungible asset, or can be represented by non-fungible tokens that represent anything from special type securities, real estate, art, etc., etc. But of course, the most disruptive are the tokens that are designed to steer DAOs. And here, very often, we have to ask ourselves, if I just create a decentralized organization, do I have a one token system or a multi-token system? What types of tokens do I have? What do these tokens do? What is their intention? Who gets which rights? And there are many questions tied to designing these, especially incentive tokens that steer DAOs. And we mentioned last time that there are many overlapping terms to describe this new emerging discipline around designing token systems, from cryptoeconomics to tokenomics to cryptogovernance to token engineering. I guess from my experience and why I created this design thinking tool, the biggest challenge that most people face when designing new token systems, or even when analyzing token systems, in their analysis or in their kind of conceptualization stage, legal questions get mixed up with technical questions, get mixed up with economic questions, they get mixed up ethical, political questions. And this is why I started out working on a framework that could be used as a step-by-step process to help us kind of untangle the important questions that we have when we set out to design token systems. And while it might seem most intuitive to start with the legal questions or the technical questions, they are, in my opinion, the last questions we have to ask ourselves. So yes, as I said, this was my motivation to come up with this design thinking framework. And for this framework, the framework is described in a whole chapter in the book, DAOs and Purpose-Driven Tokens. For those of you who didn't read the book, don't want to read the book, I would advise it for contextual purposes, but there is a free token design tool available on my website, token.kitchen. I will share the link later on. I'm not sharing it now, so your attention can stay with us directly. I will share it later in the Discord channel, and I will also share immediately the slides, by the way, so you have them immediately after the talk. Okay, so this design tool is basically, so the purpose of this tool is to use it for modeling or for analyzing token systems. And these token systems can be simple token systems that represent some kind of asset or access right token, which is managed through a more centralized governance structure by a private company, right? You can use it for designing asset and access right tokens with conventional governance structures. But this design thinking tool was first and foremost developed for designing decentralized organization, Web3 based online communities, however you might want to call them, that have one or several network tokens that incentivize the behavior of the community actions, kind of. This framework is a qualitative tool. If you're expecting some quantitative analysis, I very often get questions like, if I issue tokens, how many tokens should I issue, right? And what kind of, from a legal perspective, the first questions are legal questions. And then I'm like, okay, but what do you want to do? What is your purpose? You know, what are your political principles? And then we can ask these and what are the functions of your token before we can ask, before we can go into the quantitative parts of the design process. So we're not looking at quantitative parts, we're looking only at kind of this strategic or qualitative part where we ask ourselves, what do we want to do? What do we want to build? And how do we want to build it? Of course, the quantitative parts are very important, but they cannot precede the qualitative part, which we're discussing in the session. Because quantitative modeling and analysis only makes sense if you understand what your goal is, who the involved stakeholders are, what needs to be measured, and in which context any data should be modeled or interpreted. Yes, modeling metrics such as number of tokens issued, which is only applicable for fungible tokens, or pricing policies, which is applicable to any type of non-fungible tokens, can only be applied when you know what kind of token you're designing, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, which is why this design thinking framework is quite long. It's a set of questions that are designed in a systematic way, though so I would advise with you, walk through these questions today. The goal of the session is to walk through all these questions, and I will give you context to the questions. If you use this design thinking tool to design your own token system, please do not expect to finish the questions, answering the questions in an hour or two or even a day. It's usually a process of several weeks because it helps you in the strategic design process. So there is, unfortunately, as I said, no one-size-fits-all solution yet. We're still in the very early stages, the Wild West stages. We lack best practices. Certain crypto-economic primitives have emerged, but they're still very raw, I would say, and very isolated primitives, but that have to be used contextually depending on what you want to do. So before we go into the details of each of these questions, maybe I would like to give you an overview of the questions so you understand where the journey is going today. So this design thinking tool has several questions. We start with the purpose, obviously, the principles, the political principles of what you're trying to build, political and economic principles, the positioning of what you're trying to build. Then we go on analyzing the functions that have to be fulfilled of your token system to achieve your goal. And because this will then help us to identify which stakeholder in your network will fulfill which function, all right? So which will be the next step, defining the stakeholder types, and then identifying in more detail what their role is, which functions they fulfill, how they get incentivized, and what their obligations are. Then, and once we understand our purpose, the political principles, the positioning, the functions, and the involved stakeholders, it's only then when we look at kind of which tokens we need to incentivize the stakeholders to contribute to the collective goal. And once we've identified whether we need one token, whether we want to build a one token system or a multi-token system, then we have for each token type that we need in our system, we need to ask the economic design questions, the legal design questions, and the technical design questions, though the technical design questions will be probably the same for the infrastructure questions will probably be the same for most tokens. And last but not least, we will analyze for each token kind of the political design and the power structures that can emerge depending on how you design, which rights you give to whom in the system. And last but not least, it's also important to understand in order to achieve your goal and to create this token system, what kind of team composition do you need? So this is the question set we will be walking through today. And to make it a bit more interactive, I would suggest, I cannot, because it's a long session, we have in total 1.5 hours today. In order to make it a bit more interactive in between, I will walk you through 2 slides. Whenever you have a question, I would ask you to drop the questions in what should we do, in the chat or in Angela?
I'll monitor the chat so
Yes.
that everybody is invited to drop messages in the chat, and at some point we pick them up. Or
Okay,
what would be
that
best?
would be great if you could then read the questions. For example, I will start with purpose and principles and positioning, and after the first 3 slides, we will take a few questions, and then yes, I will try to and then move on with the next slides. I won't do many questions. Maybe you can filter the most important questions if you can see them. So
I'll
I can
try my best. So everyone bombard us with
So
with
I'm trying to leave some room for later on as well. So I will take 1 or 2, maximum 3 questions per mini Q&A, so we can move on. And some of your questions might be answered later on, so I will refer to later slides if that is the case. Okay, All right. Okay, so obviously the first question is what is the purpose of what you're trying to do? Okay, so why is it important to understand or define the purpose and have the purpose very clear? And maybe you're not clear about the purpose yet, like, but you can always circle back after you went through the whole questionnaire, and because sometimes through this process, you realize that you have to go and redefine the purpose or sharpen the purpose or make the purpose more compact, right? So yes, understanding the purpose helps to identify necessary stakeholders who would like to contribute to and use your tokenized ecosystem. And it also helps to identify what would motivate them to participate and how to best incentivize them, right? So because the purpose of the network has to be a purpose other people and institutions also identify with, otherwise they will never contribute to the thing you're building. Then the next question is, are you building a single purpose system or a multi-purpose system? Or don't you know yet? And I would very much advise to try to write the purpose in one sentence. If you cannot write the purpose in one sentence, you might not be very clear about what you want to do. Or your purpose might be too broad. And incentivizing, especially if you don't want to build a decentralized network where people can contribute autonomously, like a decentralized data exchange, like Ocean, or a decentralized payment network like Bitcoin or Ethereum, etc., then you can have various purposes maybe, but because then you don't need a completely decentralized coordination mechanisms, because designing a coordination mechanism that is kind of manipulation resistant is already very, very hard for one purpose only. This is not to say that you shouldn't create multi-purpose systems. You should just be aware that trying to fulfill the varying needs of your stakeholders with a multi-purpose system and incentivizing them in a way, it becomes very complex, very quick if you're not very sharp on what you want to do. The next one might seem a bit awkward to some people, but it's really important. It's what I call political principles. There might be more, depending on what you're building. You might have other relevant political principles. But in Web3, and I think I mentioned it very briefly last time, there are two important kind of political trade-offs or topics that you have. One is around the power structures who are in your network. How are the rights distributed in your network and who has which rights, you know? And is it more centralized? Is it more decentralized? Do you have power structures? Some people have most of the power in the network or not, and which power are we talking about? We will deep dive into these questions in a bit. And the other set of questions is around the trade-off between privacy, individual privacy, and institutional accountability. If you're building a DAO or another type of decentralized organization, you're building an institution, and accountability is the whole point of Web3, right? But unfortunately, as you might well know, blockchain networks are radically transparent and don't provide enough privacy by design per default for many of the applications you want to build. And if people don't join your network because all their data is available to everyone, that might not be a sustainable system. It might not be a legal system because there are privacy by design requirements in certain legislations or certain geographies like the European Union, for example.
Shermin, may I interrupt? Yes. Alexandra, do you have a burning question?
I don't take questions.
I can
I'm
wait.
sorry.
I'm just standing in a queue and I will wait to the questions.
Yes, please don't.
Okay,
No,
perfect.
there is
Mhm.
no questions. Please write your question.
Okay.
We have an oral Q&A session later on, but if I take questions now, we will never finish. So if you can, Alexandra, please formulate your question in the chat, and then I will try to take it. All right. Okay. So here we cannot go into the details of what is the right balance between privacy and accountability. Privacy questions are technical questions. To provide privacy by design, you have to apply various alternative cryptographic tools very often, which might be illegal in one country and desired or required in another country, or for example, in European Union countries. So privacy questions are complex techno-legal questions that cannot be answered easily. But what you need at this point in the design thinking process, what you need to have clear is what system do you want to create? Unfortunately, we live in times of increasingly less privacy. For some people who build Web3 based systems, they want to guarantee as much privacy as possible to their kind of users and to the participants of their network. For other people, it's not relevant at all. But even if it might not be relevant to you personally, it might be required by the respective jurisdictions that might be relevant for the system you're building. Again, the exact answer of how to do it, it will be something that you will be probably dealing with over a process of months, if not years, from my experience, right? There is no one-size-fits-all solution, and there is also no regulatory clarity at the moment, very often, in many cases. Okay, so back to power structures. Here, the most important question is the distribution of rights and power in your network. If you want to, so the first question here is, do you want to create a private company, like a Web2 based company, where you as the founder and the people working in your company decide about the rules of the token system you're building? Then you're building a Web2 based system and doing some kind of tokenization. That's not a bad thing. You can do that. I don't think you will be successful in the long term, because I think in the long term, this is my personal opinion, I might be wrong, we're shifting towards more and more participative online communities. If you want to create a Web3 based decentralized organization and a community where people can co-contribute, become contributors to the network you're building, and also contribute to the policy making or vote about policy upgrades, then you have to ask your question, who should be granted voting powers? Who should be granted policy making powers? Who do you want to grant executive powers? And executive powers are not necessarily management powers, because this is what we want to decentralize. In the Bitcoin network, executive networks is executing Bitcoin transactions, right? In a stable token system, executive rights or execution rights would be performed by the so-called keeper bots that execute kind of buying and selling transactions to maintain the stability of the stable token. Okay, so executive rights are different in decentralized systems than in centralized systems. But anyhow, these questions are very pressing. So who should be granted which kind of rights? And how do you want to make sure that these rights are more or less evenly managed? You can try to create a very centralized systems where a few people have all the power in the network, but you probably won't find enough people who want to join your network if that is the case. And we will see how power structures emerge in the analysis, for example, of the Bitcoin network next week. Bitcoin claims to be decentralized, but what was the intention in the beginning and how it set out to be over the years on different levels of the network, decentralization kind of varies. It becomes more and more centralized in different aspects. And this is not relevant for the initial process, but if you claim to create a decentralized autonomous network, how do you want to measure how decentralized you are, and by which standards and with which threshold? This is not important to identify in detail in the beginning, but just claiming to be decentralized doesn't make you decentralized, okay? So how do you want to prove that you're decentralized? And what do you mean when you say you're decentralized? You mean technically decentralized? You mean economically decentralized? You mean politically decentralized in terms of policymaking power and voting power? What do you mean when you say decentralized? Okay, and how do you want to measure it? How do you want to prove it? How do you want to maintain this over time? Okay, and then when it comes, as I said, the next point, individual privacy versus institutional accountability. I think the most important questions that you need to resolve for yourself is, what are the acceptable trade-offs? Because there will always be trade-offs, and they are quite hard to swallow. And these are questions that you can only answer with your technical team and your legal team based on the analysis of what you want to do and in which jurisdiction you want to do these things. I mean, obviously Web3 networks are global, but which are the relevant jurisdictions based on where you're based and where your developers are based, or where you see your main market. Okay, and positioning is very obvious. It's not special to Web3 networks or token systems. Obviously, before you start designing or creating your system, the question that you should ask yourself is, do other people do what you're doing already? If yes, what makes you particularly unique? Who would be potential competitors? This is relevant if you, especially in decentralized networks, you need network effects. You need a minimum viable economy. So you want people to join your network, and how do you motivate them to join your network if other people are already doing the same things? Who are potential partners with which you can integrate, which, for example, Web3 protocols already exist. I mean, smart contracts are inherently modular because of the nature of Web3 networks. So if you're building some kind of, for example, data exchange protocol, how would it automatically integrate with other DeFi protocols, for example? And yeah, last but not least, this is the question. How can you make sure to create a minimum viable economy through partnerships based on the fact that you're doing something unique? And obviously, then you need to think about a marketing strategy to make people aware of who you are and what you're doing, maybe do some airdrops to create some economic traction in the beginning, et cetera, et cetera. But these are technical details. Positioning, understanding the positioning in time is very important. So I'll stop here and take a few questions before we move on.
Cool. So I'll read it out. We have two very interesting questions, or three. Yes. How detailed should the role of privacy be described? Can you give an example? Is it similar to how we describe the access right, so that the metrics of all data items and possible actions and types of participants? How detailed should the role of privacy?
I think I know what you mean. So, for example, many blockchain networks after Bitcoin, because Bitcoin was never private, right? It was anonymous, but it didn't have full privacy because it was actually a test network when it was deployed. So, but then it became the main network soon. It never left the test network stage. So other blockchain, other developers came and said, okay, Bitcoin is great, but let's do a more privacy preserving Bitcoin. They started to develop Monero, Zcash, etc. Many cryptocurrencies that do the same thing as Bitcoin, but they have more privacy, inbuilt privacy, because they use alternative cryptographic tools. Obviously, to the developers of these blockchain networks, privacy was the most important factor, right? When they set out to build that, regulation of Web3 networks was not an explicit thing yet. Obviously, regulation always applies in the country where you live, but in the very early stages, regulatory authorities are still very slow. While we're still in the kind of design thinking Wild West of tokens, regulators have already caught up. So they will, so you actually have two trade-offs. You have the trade-off between depending on where are you building, if you're building your own blockchain infrastructure, the question is, what privacy preserving tools do you want to use? If you're building an application layer token system or DAO, then you will have the privacy features of the blockchain network you're using. Are you using the Ethereum network? Which privacy features does the Ethereum network give you? Are you using the Solana network? Are you building something on the Bitcoin network? So depending on the network on which you are building a decentralized application, you will have the privacy features of that application. And that might be in conflict of the privacy features that you want to have, and I don't know what you want, you know, and from your political motivation, your personal political motivation of doing things. And then there is the question of what authorities allow you to do. But then we have so many different jurisdictions who have very different opinions on privacy and privacy technology. So it's not easy to answer, unfortunately.
Okay, we have more, and I take just the second and we see how far we can go. Second, I would also love to see an example of the measurement statement for the power distribution. I'm struggling to understand even in what units to measure the degree of decentralization.
Yes, this is what you have to do. This is not my job. This is your job. If you claim to create a decentralized organization and I don't know what your DAO is doing, then you have to come up with a metric to measure it. And I also struggle, and everybody is struggling, because everybody claims decentralization, but we're not measuring it. So you're struggling, as we all are. And so I'm just urging you, if you claim to have something decentralized, then please, what is the goal? And come up with a unit of, because decentralization exists on a spectrum. There is no such thing as fully centralized and fully decentralized. Okay, so what do you want to have decentralized in your system? You know, do you want to have it geographically decentralized? Do you want to have it politically decentralized? Do you want to have it economically decentralized? And how much? And then what's the gradient? You know, if 10% or 5% of your token, I take an example. We had this social network called Steemit many years ago, was very successful, is one of the use cases, had millions of adopters, was on the way of becoming this new Web3 based social network in 2015, 16, 17, very early. People were making lots of money with it. But then after 2 years, people stopped using the network because the token incentives were designed in a way that the top 2 to 5% had 95% of all Steem tokens in the network. So other people had no incentive to participate. If you want to understand the problem with power structures that emerge over time, I highly advise you to analyze existing or DAOs that have existed for a while and analyze the use cases. If you don't want to analyze your own use cases, I have 6 use cases I analyzed in my book. Yeah, we
Awesome.
still lack the metrics, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, one more.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, let's do one more for this first one and then go slower for the other ones.
Joanne, would you switch on your mic? I think reading out takes almost longer than if you repeat your question.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know if it's a question so much as a comment, but I kind of miss in this and maybe some of the things I've read too, a bit more awareness on the possible unintended consequences of our
We are
system.
not there yet, my dear. Yes, these are the first slides.
All right.
Yes, but I think this is very, very important. What you're saying, the unintended consequences is very important. But this is why I'm saying, like, please don't go into designing a token from a legal perspective or a technical perspective before you ask the question of what you want to do, what is the purpose, and what are your principles? Because you need to know your principles.
That is exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
To be fair.
Okay.
I'm not talking technically or legally.
Okay.
I'm speaking of the ethical attitude towards designing these systems.
Yes, but this is why I'm mentioning. I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah.
In order to understand, because we're not in the design process of the token yet, but you first need to ask this meta question of what system do you want to build and with what principles do you want to build it before you go on designing the properties of a token, because the properties of a token start to have unintended consequences soon. And we will talk about the use case of Bitcoin and unintended consequences of Bitcoin next time in detail. Okay,
thank you.
All right, because what you're saying is actually one of the reasons I came up with this design thinking framework. So it's good that you mentioned it.
Okay, then final one.
I think we should move on because otherwise. Okay, but okay, go on.
How can you measure what the critical mass should be to have the minimum viable economy in your system?
Again, this depends on the purpose, and there is no one size fits all metric, right? It depends. If you're like the first, I think, for example, if you're the first one, if you're doing something completely new that nobody has done before, the threshold of a minimum viable economy might be less than if you already have 5 competitors who are doing more or less the same thing. That's, I think, one metric and one kind of factor to think about. And then it really depends on what you're building and how many people you need to create this minimum viable, this traction, this network effects. And yeah, there is no minimum number here. It's just, it's a combination of factors, you know. This is the magic of creating a new thing, whether it's, we used in the startup or in Web3, we used to call it startups. And now it's Web3 based online communities, startup online communities. Very different for each one, I think. All right, should we move on?
We have one more question, but up to you.
Okay.
On the MVP, any generic metric of measurement without any specificity?
No.
Okay.
No. Not that I know of. Maybe certain, listen, how do you want to have a generic measurement for something? You know, are you creating a decentralized social network? Is a very different thing than if you're creating a peer-to-peer data exchange. And even if you were to have maybe within the same thing you're building, there are already network metrics, but not that I know of. You know, this is, they don't exist, but what you need is minimum traction, you know. Yeah, not that I know of, sorry.
Okay, let's continue. No more questions in the chat, but everyone, drop your question.
All right. I'll try to be quick. Okay, so functions are the next. We're not thinking of tokens yet. Why? Because we need to think about functions. The functions are very much interrelated with the stakeholders in your network who will fulfill the functions, okay? For example, in the Bitcoin network, mining node operators fulfill the function of adding, verifying blockchain transactions, contributing to the security system of the network, making sure that transactions are valid, that there no double spending is happening, and if they're the fastest one to resolve the puzzle, they get to even add kind of the all the transactions in the block to the new block. They get to create the new block, and in this new block, the new tokens are minted. So they are actually fulfilling two functions or three functions: verifying, adding transactions to the ledger. And in the case of adding transactions to the ledger, they're also minting the new tokens in the new block. You know, what central banks usually do, they fulfill the functions of private banks and central banks in one stakeholder, right? Central bank mint the new tokens, and transactions are verified in financial markets through the interbanking system of banks communicating the status of their ledgers with each other. So what is important to understand or list here is all the functions that need to be fulfilled by your token system you're creating, because this is the basis of then identifying who will fulfill this function and how to incentivize them. You will have functions, sub-functions. Understanding how they relate to each other is also important. And as I said, the most important thing then is to identify who should fulfill this function. And this might seem a bit too complex in the beginning. If you do this for the first time, it's, as I said, an iterative process. Try to be as precise as you can, but maybe not too precise, right? And go back and reiterate once you finish the whole process. But as I said, the functions are important because the question is, who will fulfill this function? How will these stakeholders be incentivized to contribute to do this in the network? Why should I, in Bitcoin, invest into a computer, into hardware, into energy, and come up with time to validate Bitcoin transactions? Well, because I have the potential to earn Bitcoin tokens as an incentive. Why should I buy or sell assets in MakerDAO that maintain collateral assets in MakerDAO? Because I have arbitrage opportunities as a keeper bot to buy or sell collateral assets. And this is important for the stable token system to maintain the peg to the US dollar. And I, as the operator of a keeper bot, am incentivized through potential arbitrage opportunities, for those of you who know the MakerDAO use case, okay? So nobody will probably participate in your system if there are no incentives attached to that. Incentives don't necessarily have to be economic. The first kind of cryptoeconomic systems that we created had economic incentives only, but they could be non-economic. You could create status points that are valid for other things, reputation tokens, etc., access right tokens. In the end, everything translates somehow often to economic status as well. And the last question here, when you, the incentives that you award to the stakeholders, will they be automatically distributed through automated mechanism that is enforced by the protocol? Or are the incentives shielded out by human discretion? So very often in the DAO ecosystems of the last year, we had many organizations that emerged that claimed to be decentralized, or they called themselves DAOs, but very often they had in their foundation, people worked for the foundations who decided about who will get how much, how many incentives in a human kind of decision-making process, or who gets to work, fulfill certain traditional management tasks in a non-automated way. So incentives can be automated or non-automated. The big art of decentralization is to automate it. I doubt that we can fully automate everything. So we will have non-automated parts as well. Okay, the next here, I'm always a bit confused whether I should mention the stakeholders before the functions or vice versa. But I think the thinking in terms of function precedes kind of the stakeholders, because it's part of how to incentivize the stakeholders. But sometimes it's easier for people to think about who will participate in my system. So if it's easier for you to fill out this slide first, or this set of questions first, go ahead, fill out this set of questions first. So identifying the stakeholders in a distributed network is one of the most important things to do. I suggest following process. You can first just brainstorm all stakeholders that you think might contribute in some way or the other without being clear yet about how they contribute. Just list them. Then it helps to group them. And grouping them, you could do it along following criteria. You would have stakeholders that are inside your network. They're part of your network, and then you might have stakeholders who are outside of your network, but who influence your network, or they work on the fringes of your network. Think, for example, again, if we think about the Bitcoin network, node operators would be internal stakeholders, right? Users who own Bitcoin and have manage a Bitcoin wallet are internal stakeholders. And at the fringes, you have, for example, external stakeholders are stakeholders, for example, national regulators who influence the legal status of Bitcoin through regulation. On the fringes of the network, you would have exchanges operating who on-ramp and off-ramp from the crypto world into the fiat world. So understanding who's inside, who's on the fringe, and who's outside, but still influencing your network, I think helps to visualize the stakeholders of your system. Then you can distinguish between producers or consumers of your system services. For example, in a social network, you would have the influencers or the content in a decentralized social network like Steemit or now Friends Tech as a more modern example. You have the content creators or influencers who contribute with content. They are the producers of system services. And then you have the consumer of system services who consume the content of the content creators or the influencers. And they're like the two sides of the marketplace or that you're creating. The same would be true for a decentralized data exchange. You would have the data kind of owners who are the producers of these system services, and then you have the people who want to buy data over a decentralized data exchange. Then it's important also to understand human stakeholders versus automated stakeholders. Why is this important to understand? Because humans act within the network with bias. Humans have mental shortcuts. Their behavioral economics is very important when studying how humans behave in an economic system in general, in cryptoeconomic systems in particular. Automated stakeholders like keeper bots or even any kind of mining node. It's not people mining actually Bitcoins. It's like people owning computers who then download the code and this bot on their computer operates the functions of kind of verifying Bitcoin transactions and adding blocks to the ledger. This is done by bots. So computers operate differently in networks than humans, and understanding this difference, because computers are optimized towards one purpose or one function, and they will do that. And humans have non-economic preferences, they make mental shortcuts and make other types of decisions. And then you have private and institutional stakeholders who might act differently because private individuals have maybe limited resources, have different motivations than institutional stakeholders. And depending on the system you're building, they might act differently in your system. Understanding how they act differently would help here. So once you've kind of brainstormed all the stakeholders you have, you've grouped them, this is just for overview purposes for yourself to understand the dynamics in your system. Then you can use this kind of metrics to list each stakeholder type and identify the role of each stakeholder, the functions they fulfill, the rights and permissions they have in the system, and the rewards they get for contributing to the system, and the obligations that they might have. Two disclaimers here. Stakeholders are not individuals, usually. It's group of individuals. I've done this workshop a few times, and sometimes people fill out this form writing CEO. So individual roles don't think about, think in terms of companies, think in terms of nations, where you have a different kind of demographic groups doing different things in your nation. And so stakeholder groups, for example, in a social network, you would have the content contributors and the content consumers. And maybe you'd have the content curators, right? And they could overlap with the consumers, but maybe not necessarily. So then you would write here content contributor, identify the role, and the role depends, their role. So role means, yes, which role do they fulfill towards this collective goal that you have in your system. And then based on the functions that you identified before, which system functions do they fulfill? Content contributors, content creators in a decentralized social network upload content or provide content to the system, or hopefully content that's relevant to the content consumers, content curators. Otherwise, you don't have a minimum viable community. This is talking about minimum viable communities here. We don't have measures, right? Hard measures, but what it helps, usually you have some kind of marketplace where somebody provides a good or a service and others consume it, others curate it, others provide to their stability or the quality curation, depending on the purpose of your network. But what is clear that you will never have a minimum viable economy if you only have one stakeholder type. For example, in my book, I analyze one of the use cases I analyzed is the Helium network. It's a very interesting use case because it's a peer-to-peer telecommunication network where you're incentivized to buy a mini antenna that costs like a few €100, put it in your home, and depending on the location of your home, you will relay more or less data through this antenna for this telecommunication network. And upon proof of data relaying, let's say, you get awarded Helium network tokens. I'm simplifying now, right? The problem with Helium was their value proposition was great, yes, but they focused on one type of, not like a mobile telecommunication network. They started with a LoRaWAN, which is kind of ideal for the low range wide area network. That's ideal for, they said it's ideal for IoT data to be communicated, right? Because this was before 5G was widespread in many locations, and mobile data was still very expensive. And the idea was to use this alternative telecommunication network. The problem was that over the years, Helium had many hotspots. They called these mini antennas that you could buy and put in your home and earn tokens for relaying data. They called them hotspots. So the network over the years had many hotspot operators, but they never had people who used the telecommunication network to relay data, right? So if you only have people who provide system infrastructure, but nobody uses the system infrastructure, you don't have a market and you don't have a minimum viable economy, right? So often the question of a minimum viable economy is not metric based, but it's the balance between those who provide. It's the magical balance between those who provide and those who consume and those who are kind of the drum makers for the system. Yeah. So I hope this is clear. Yes, before we proceed, I take the next set of questions because then we get into the tokens.
I have rather comments than questions.
Okay, good.
Should I pick it up or?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I'm just checking the time to see how much we have. We have half an hour left. And then how many comments do you have?
One longer comment and one short question. Let's start with a short question. Can simulations help get an idea of minimum viable economy?
I think yes. Depending on what you're trying to build, there is a growing list of, you're probably aware of simulation tools. They help identify certain dynamics that can unfold over time, and a minimum viable economy might be related to it. But I think this is, since we don't have the metrics, the simulation itself will not help, but the simulation will help you identify how the system dynamics can unfold over time, if power structures could emerge, etc. Especially around allocation of asset tokens in the system or the currency in the system, that the rich become richer and the poor become poorer in the system, and then nobody is interested to be part of your system anymore because participating in your system doesn't make you earn enough tokens, right? And this is where simulation helps. Minimum viable economy as such, I don't think so. We don't hear you.
Chima asks, could we analyze a particular token design system of any project? This will give more clarity. I think this is exactly what we planned, right, Shermin?
Yes, we're planning to do this in the next 2 sessions. All right.
Cool, Chima.
And again, apologies for the theory, but we have to walk through the theory so it makes sense what we will be discussing next time, right?
Thumbs up from Shima. All good.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Joanne, would you like to switch on your mic?
No, it's fine. I just
All
wanted
good.
to continue the discussion in the chat.
Yeah, perfect. All good. Thank you. I think that's it for now.
Okay. Let's go then in because I think this is why people came. Tokens. So, okay, now we're there, now we can think about the number of type of tokens. You know what you want to do, what's your goal, what's the collective goal of your system? Do you have one goal or multiple goals? How do you incentivize? Who are your stakeholders? Which functions do they fulfill? And are all functions fulfilled? Because yes, as I said, if you have people only becoming providers of infrastructure services like your telecommunication network, but nobody consumes your telecommunication network, an important function is not fulfilled, right? now it's time to think about, okay, how many token types do you need for your system? Do you need, would you want, or will you build a single token system, like in the case of Bitcoin, right? Or are you creating a multi-token system, like in the case of Ocean Protocol? I know that Ocean Protocol recently merged with other protocols, and they've changed some of their system rules, but Ocean Protocol set out initially with 1 token, and when I analyzed their use case, they already had 5 tokens, system tokens. This is also one of, if you are interested in analyzing multi-token systems, I think Ocean Protocol might be an interesting use case to look at. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to look at all the use cases I've already analyzed. Angela and I decided to analyze Bitcoin next week because it's the use case most people think they know, but they actually don't. And with any other use case, we would need to explain so much more. So, but yeah, Bitcoin is a single token system, and it was already so hard and groundbreaking to create proof of work as the coordination mechanism, right? It was the groundbreaking, that was the revolutionary thing which made the transition from Web 2 to Web 3 potentially, right? Was proof of work. 1 token, 1 coordination mechanism. If you have more tokens and you have more coordination mechanisms, you're adding complexity. Not necessarily a bad thing, but wherever you add complex, and it might be necessary, but wherever you add complexity, you add opportunities for mistakes, system errors, attacks, etc., misalignment, etc. Okay, once you know how many tokens you want, please, yes, identify the purpose of each token and make sure that the purposes don't overlap, because then it might make sense to create 1 token instead of 2, right? Consolidate the number of tokens you're creating. And when you design the properties of the token, and we will look at the token properties in the next slide, make sure that the properties actually are aligned. Once you've kind of designed the properties, now this is when you can go into the simulation, right? Economic simulation, once you've defined the economic properties, but then make sure they're aligned with your goal. And in order to maybe test that, simulation tools make sense. All right. So for each token type that you're creating, you have, as I said before, economic, legal, and technical and political questions. In the economic design, again, first question, what is the purpose of the token? Which rights, the next question, which is probably one of the most important questions, what rights and conditions or obligations? I think I wanted to write obligation, not conditions. Yes, you could say conditions. Which rights and obligations are attached to your tokens? And what does it let you do in the system? So you could attach property rights to the token. For example, sharing, owning a share in your DAO, an ownership token, or a currency of your system, like Bitcoin or Ethereum. These tokens can also represent access or usage rights. Bitcoin, for example, we think of Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. It's a currency that has a value, it's volatile. Some say it's money, others say it's not money. But Bitcoin is not only a property right. Bitcoin tokens also come with attached usage rights because of how the Bitcoin protocol is designed. You cannot send Bitcoins from one wallet to another wallet without paying fees. And you pay your fees, or you could under certain circumstances, but it's very rare. And it's becoming increasingly less possible with the clogging of the network. But you need Bitcoin tokens to pay for the transaction fees to the miners. You cannot pay transaction fees in euro or dollar or any other kind of cryptocurrency. You have to pay in Bitcoin. This means that Bitcoins also represent usage rights of the Bitcoin network and access rights, and usage rights of the Bitcoin network. Tokens can come with attached information rights. Tokens could give you explicit or implicit execution rights to do something in the network and then get rewarded for them with some kind of token or fiat currency. But usually when we talk about permissionless systems, tokens don't come with explicit management or execution rights, because anyone can participate in the systems. And unless you need tokens to participate in their system, what would be such a token to be able to execute something in the system? Angela, I'm asking you.
What would be, can you repeat the question?
Yes, what would be a token where you would need to own these tokens to be able to execute something in a Web3 network? Execute
to me, it's an access right.
No. Okay, I don't know how to say. So for example, let me give you the answer and then it's clear.
Okay.
In proof of stake based networks, you need to proof stake. You're putting up a collateral. You need network tokens that can be slashed in case you don't behave according to the network rules, right? So in this case, the execution rights, executing Ethereum transactions are related to the ownership this token. Right.
And this is a V token model commonly called.
Any kind of V token, for those who know what V tokens is, V tokens, more voting right tokens. I'm not a fan of the V token model because I think that voting rights and execution rights get confused. Economics is part of politics, but voting is, yes, but I hope you understand what I mean. So if you own Bitcoin, owning Bitcoin doesn't give you special privileges in the Bitcoin network, except for being able to pay for Bitcoin transactions. In the Ethereum network, after the transition from proof of work to proof of stake, the ownership of Ethereum tokens, Ether, gives you the privilege. Only people who own Ether can execute transactions in the network. And they have to own a minimum Ether, or, well, they're part of a pool and then they need to own a minimum. That would be execution rights. Policy-making rights could be tied to tokens, and voting rights can be tied to tokens. Very often, this is put in one bucket of governance. People talk about governance tokens, and they mean policy-making rights. They usually mean voting rights only, right? Because policy-making is... These things are different and should be policymaking in most systems. Up until now, policymaking rights were permissionless, but voting rights were attached to the ownership of a token or the existence of a wallet. Okay. The next, in the economic design process, the next question is, are you creating a fungible token? Is this a fungible or non-fungible token? If it is a fungible token, questions of supply are relevant. If it's a non-fungible token, traditional pricing mechanisms are relevant, okay? Yes, so probably all of you know, anything that is a currency or a commodity that is interchangeable, has interchangeable units, is fungible, it has identical attributes and can serve as quasi-money. It could be the designated medium of exchange of your network or your token system, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Ocean Protocol, for example, has a kind of a protocol token which you can pay, but it's not the only currency they accept. Most other networks only accept their own currency tokens. Okay. When you create some kind of currency, you have to think about supply. Bitcoin, and this is where questions of monetary policy are relevant. This is where you will need a macroeconomist to help you. We will not go into the details today, right? The only thing I can tell you is that Bitcoin has had a hard cap, a hard monetary policy. This cannot be changed. Ethereum from the beginning was much more flexible in its monetary policy. They changed the monetary policy several times. These are macroeconomic questions where you need macroeconomists to help you if you have you're designing a fungible token as a currency of your network. If you're creating, issuing, for example, non-fungible tokens, some kind of art tokens, some kind of in the digital or virtual world, other types of tokens that have unique attributes, the question is, obviously you don't have supply questions, you have traditional pricing questions. And price is always like where supply and demand meets, and how you also market your product and how much hype you can generate for creating special, super unique NFTs that people pay millions for. Something I never understood. I wouldn't be willing to pay $2 million for an art NFT. Other people do. So it's a personal preference, and it has nothing to do with supply policy, because it's this is different for non-fungible tokens. Yes, so when it comes to pricing strategies, you need marketing people. When it comes to stability mechanisms of fungible tokens, you need macroeconomists. Two very different things, okay? So what kind of token are you creating? You will need very different people to identify price, etc., supply, etc. Transferability is one of the another property that is relevant in the economic context. You could create tokens that are tied, for example, to the identity of a person or institution, and they're designed to have limited transferability or not be transferable at all, right? Fungible tokens, money, traditionally was always designed, or in most economic systems was designed to have unlimited transferability. That's the nature of a medium of exchange, is that you can transfer it from one person to the other, right? If you create, for example, a system, I once a kind of exchange trading system where you exchange time, these time banks. I had actually in Berlin, a woman in Berlin a few years ago was creating a token system for elderly care. And the idea there was that when you design this token system, you have to make sure, because it's based on the time bank idea, you provide for someone, and you have kind of time credits, tokenized time credits that you can use at a later date. But in order to avoid secondary markets, they wanted to create a system where the time credit can only be consumed by you and by no one else. And then they saw that this might be too restrictive. And then they wanted to design a system where there was a limited transferability to only other family members, but no non-family member, because they didn't want any derivatives markets to be created on top of kind of these time bank tokens, right? Whether or not these questions. So in this case, the idea was to create limited transferability that is tied to the identity of a person and their family members, okay? Whether or not it's a sensible design is a different question, but in some use cases, it might make sense to limit the transferability of a token. I think Yes. Yes. No, this gets too complex. I'm skipping my line of thought here. Okay, another important question is, when is the token minted and does the token expire? Okay. Upon which event is the token minted? Are the tokens created because somebody is buying an NFT with fiat currency, right? Or are the tokens minted upon behavior of a contribution to a social network, and the tokens are minted upon proof of contribution to that social network? This was the case in Steemit, but these tokens were usually created once a week, and then they were gathered in a pool, and then they were distributed to the content creators and the content curators. In the case of Bitcoin, tokens are created upon proof of work, and they're minted the moment a new block of transaction is added to the ledger, and there is extra space in this block data for kind of creating these new tokens and having a provenance of the newly minted tokens. So knowing when a token is created and if it expires, upon which event it expires, is very important. For example, access right tokens, money is usually designed not to expire, usually. It might make sense to have, but we might have different monetary systems. If money would expire after a while, people would maybe would not hoard money so much, and we might not have as many economic inequalities as we have today in our system, right? But because money is designed to never expire, people like to hoard, and the rich become richer and the poor become poorer, also because of the interest-based system that we have, okay? What if we would design an economic system like Bitcoin, Bitcoin which expires after a time? So if you don't transfer it from A to B, it expires. Would we have more economic equality, long-term equality in the system? Yes or no? That's an interesting question. But apart from this philosophical question, access right tokens, when it comes to expiry events, access right tokens typically always have an expiry event. If it's an access right token, for example, to a concert, obviously upon consummation, upon going to the concert, the token will expire. But even if you don't go to a concert, after the time the concert has stopped, the token expires, whether or not you joined it or not. So the questions of expiry event are very important. They might come naturally to the type of token, as in the case of access right tokens. They can be artificially created for some kind of demo rush system of a currency where the currency just expires after not being spent for a certain amount of time. And typically, for example, bonus miles that you collect have expiry events. So they're kind of an internal currency of an airline system where you can collect their currency and do something with that money. And they're usually designed to expire after a while because they're designed like vouchers that expire, but you can use them as money. Convertibility is the last property that is important. I'm sure there are many other properties also. These are the main economic properties, or they're not only economic properties, but from an economic perspective, relevant also, is convertibility. Sometimes a token can convert to be something else. For example, an access right token to a conference that becomes a proof of attendance after the conference has ended. That would be a convertible token. Or a V token. Angela, you mentioned V tokens before in the ocean system. In order to be able to execute voting rights in a network, you have to lock your network tokens. During this time frame, you cannot, they become converted. Your stake in the network temporarily converts to a voting right, and you can reconvert it to a stake on the network after voting period expired, right? But during that time, you cannot sell it. It doesn't exist as a property right per se, right? Okay. just looking at the time. Okay, we had too many questions. I will run through the next set of questions, and we can go, from my part, we can go 10 minutes, 15 minutes longer. But just to make sure, we will become much more practical in the next 2 sessions based on this design thinking framework. So don't be frustrated and take your time to read through it yourself. After this session, I will share the link. Next question per token you're designing are the legal design questions. I'm reading this out loud. So first question is applicable jurisdiction, which transnational, national, local jurisdictions apply for each of your token types? The same question, which laws, transnational, national, local jurisdictions apply to your organizational structure, right? Because one thing is the type of organization you're creating. DAOs are not well regulated yet. So if you're creating a DAO, if you're creating a traditional organization, you don't have any problems. This is a very important and valid question, but you don't have any problems because this is clear, right? But in the case of a DAO, it makes sense to understand whether the jurisdiction which applies, how they would regulate DAOs, or if they're not regulated at all. But there is no such thing as non-regulated. Usually some kind of general regulation takes over in this case. The next question, are you operating a centralized organization that is incorporated in a specific country? Then the case is clear. But if you're operating some form of DAO, will you do that in some form of incorporated way or not? And there are many legal designers that have experience of how to circumvent the non-existence of DAO laws through foundations in Liechtenstein or whatever, very complex answers. We cannot cover them. You will need to hire lawyers. You will need to have money to hire those lawyers if you want to create a DAO and not have any legal problems in the future, or avoid them as much as you can. Related to this question, will you as a founder stay anonymous or will your identity be public? I don't think long-term anonymity is possible, but that might influence certain decisions if you want to do things that are not well regulated or whatever. Do your main developers or operators live in different jurisdictions? That could be a relevant question. So applicable jurisdiction based on your token types and organizational structures and where your main developers and founders are based. And applicable regulatory bodies within those jurisdictions is the next question. Which securities law, is securities law relevant to what you're doing? Is financial markets law relevant? Privacy laws, are they relevant? Probably many legal, regulatory bodies will have a say in what you're trying to do. Navigating the sea of regulations, you cannot ignore it at this point in time. 5, 6, 7 years ago, it might have been a bit different, but right now you want to ask yourself those questions. If real world assets and intellectual property is involved in what you're trying to do, there are questions of, if you're operate a DAO, which kind of legal entity will be holding and managing these real world assets. And last but not least, legal budget. Very important. Do not ignore it. It's not enough to have a lawyer friend or maybe a co-founder who is a lawyer. You need a legal budget. Without a legal budget, it will be difficult. Technical design, last but not least, are very important questions, but they come at the very end, unless what you are building is a blockchain network, a technical infrastructure, kind of Web3 infrastructure itself. But if you're building a decentralized organization or some token system on top of Web3, then the technical design questions come, I think, are one of the last questions. So the question here is infrastructure. Will you create your own Web3 infrastructure, your own blockchain network, or will you use an existing blockchain network or blockchain infrastructure? Here, it makes sense to make a cost-benefit analysis of your options. Less and less, the tendency is less and less to build on top of existing blockchain infrastructures. A few years ago, people would build their own blockchain network. Now people are transitioning from their own blockchain networks to Solana, Ethereum, and more Bitcoin, to build their decentralized applications on top of an existing legacy network and ecosystem around this legacy network. Interoperability questions are very important, especially, for example, in DeFi, right? Since blockchain networks, unfortunately, as you know, cannot natively communicate with each other, various interoperability approaches are needed. And depending on your use case, some DeFi protocols built on the Ethereum use case only, but other use cases, and this is one of the reasons the Ethereum use case became so big, because people were building within the Ethereum ecosystem, and then the Ethereum ecosystem became bigger because everybody started to build in the Ethereum ecosystem, and interoperability was still an issue. For other use cases, you might not be able to stay within one ecosystem only, so you have to look at interoperability, bridging solutions, etc. And here you have to make a trade-off analysis between securability, scalability, and durability of your system, and whether or not these interoperability solutions and are secure enough also, and whether or not the blockchain infrastructure you're using is fast and secure enough for the purpose of what you're exchanging. You might be creating systems that don't exchange too many financial assets, so you might be able to build on systems that are not as 100% secure, like, or almost 100% secure like other systems. So depending on your use case, different trade-off scenarios apply in your cost benefit and security analysis. Scalability is an issue. Which blockchain infrastructure gives you enough scalability, but with scalability comes the question of fees. And I think I need to explain this, write this explicitly. Fees nowadays in public blockchain networks are very, very high. They've gone down due to various second layer solutions and newer consensus protocols, but you need to make sure that your system is scalable enough to handle all the transactions that you need, but that it's also cheap enough, because if the transaction fees are higher than what your users can afford, you have to think about absorbing these transaction fees, and you have the money or other income, network income, to absorb these transaction fees. So scalabilities and fees go hand in hand. Now, when it comes to designing a token itself, different ecosystems have their own token standards where you don't have to create your own smart contract, but you also already have a standardized, stress-tested token standards for fungible tokens, non-fungible tokens, convertible tokens, semi-fungible tokens, or data tokens. More and more standards that specialize on special industries or properties have emerged, and it's advisable to use token standards instead of creating your own smart contracts, because of potential security loopholes in many use cases. And then last but not least, the issue of privacy, technical privacy, based on which level of privacy you would like to use, you will need a different blockchain infrastructure that offers different levels of privacy by design, or has layer 2 networks that have ZK rollups or something that would offer not only the scalability, but also the privacy features that would be necessary for what you want to do. And what are The question of what you're obliged to do are different by law, are different to what you choose to offer or create by principles of your personal principles or principles of your community. Okay, last but not least, token distribution and power structures, the ethical and political considerations that were mentioned before. I forgot who mentioned that before. This is very important based on the, here we have different power structures that can emerge over time, and very often they emerge as unintended consequences of the token design. So who has policy-making power? There are different types of power structures: policy-making power, voting power, information power, market power, mediation power, and the power that stay completely, I call them emergent stakeholders. Very often in a network, and we will see it with Bitcoin next week, you have completely new stakeholders that were never anticipated when the system was designed. And these new stakeholders change the power structure dynamics in the system. An example which we will look at are, for example, the mining pool, the mining cartels that emerged over time in Bitcoin, or coin analytics, which started to give more power to the regulators, but we'll look at the details tomorrow. So when we analyze existing blockchain networks and DAOs, we see that very often, quite quickly after a few years, we have the market power becomes skewed towards a handful of people, often less than 1% of the token holders have most of the tokens in the system. Obviously, this is a power structure that is not sustainable because nobody wants to be part of a system where 1% has almost all the tokens. And we have many examples for that. The same is true for voting powers and policy-making powers. And here we have to think about, everybody might be, in theory, allowed to contribute to creating policy for the system, have policy-making power, like in Bitcoin. But then the question is, who has the time and who has the know-how to actually contribute to the Bitcoin network, right? Everyone can, while it is permissionless in theory, most people don't even have the higher mathematical skills to understand the Bitcoin network in theory, let alone contribute to it, read the protocol, understand the whole dynamics, keep up with it next to a full-time job, and make good policymaking proposals in form of code, right? So theoretical inclusion and practical inclusion are very different things. The same is true for voting power. We have seen in many in DAOs that even though many people had voting powers, many token holders had voting powers, less than 5%, sometimes only a handful of people would participate in policymaking votes in a DAO. So when you give out voting powers, and how kind of inclusive is a system where 95% of people or more don't participate in the votes of how to upgrade the system, or how decentralized is a system if in the end nobody votes for system upgrades, right? And unfortunately here we have many examples of DAOs where really inclusion was a problem. And a good example for this is MakerDAO, and this is also one of the reasons they're transitioning to completely new governance style. Okay, I think I will stop here. Last one, team composition. When you create your team, interdisciplinary know-how is very important, much more so than in previous iterations of creating web-based systems. Just make sure to have all aspects of your economical, political, legal, and technical know-how in your core team. And if you don't have the people in your core team, make sure to have enough budget to hire the experts who can help you. And make sure to have enough balance. So we're over time. If there's one or two more questions, I'm happy to answer.
Hey, a lot of messages in the chat. I think it's great to see the conversation going. And let me see if I can pick a lot of comments here. Okay, I pick one. Is the legal design the last question to be asked after the technical? Because if the token system has no minimum viability, there will be no need to answer legal questions.
Okay, obviously this questionnaire is designed in a linear fashion, right? But it is, because I cannot go in circles, but like practically when you fill out this questionnaire, you will go in circles, okay? So I tried to do it chronologically in the most logical order that was possible to me, but
yeah,
if you create a system, the legal systems are, the legal questions are not the last ones. I think the legal and the technical questions are the ones that you can only answer once you knew what you want to do and how you want to do it. Does that make sense? Because if you don't, any lawyer will tell you what should your token do. You know, what is the purpose of your token? What you want it to do? And then I can tell you what legal questions apply and what you have to mind, but you have to tell me what it does or you want it to do. And then I can tell you what is possible, what is not possible. And then we can go back and reiterate it, right? It's not like a linear process only. Ideally, you will work hand in hand with your lawyers, legal team, you will work hand in hand with your technical team. And it's an iterative process between what you want to do and what is possible to do from a technical and from a legal perspective and what the trade-offs are. And then sometimes you have to make hard decisions.
Okay. Also, cool. All right. I think it's great to see that you start discussing, and yes, please do continue the discussion on the Discord channel, track number 1. I think many really inspiring threads have been opened, so please do continue, and I'm very much looking forward.
Can I comment a few of the questions?
Sure.
Yes. So I'm just reading over some of the comments and questions.
Yeah.
So somebody is saying, but that reflects kind of the income disparities or the economic differences. So Adit is writing, but that's reflection of real world, right? 1% hold 80 to 90% of real world wealth. Yes, it's true. And why? Because we designed Bitcoin and Ethereum like our traditional monetary system. This is why I said that if Bitcoin were designed to be or expire after 2 years of hoarding in a wallet, people would have different spending behavior. They would spend Bitcoin, not hoard them, and the rich would not become richer. Staking would only have limited options, etc., and we would have a different system. So unless we stop designing our token systems like we're designing our real economy, we will have the same reflection of power disparities. Yes. And yes, there are many other comments that are hard to, yes, that would merit a discussion. Okay, the last session, in the next session, we will analyze the Bitcoin use case. Then I will give you a homework in groups to work on taking this design thinking framework and analyzing a use case and sending me the homework for analysis. In the last session, we will selectively invite a few people to present their results, and we will have I hope half an hour for Q&A to do some general discussions on many of the things that are mentioned here now.
Right, and again, This is not limited to the live sessions only. I think super relevant points were raised. Thank you so much for participating in this live session today. See you on Discord. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll meet again next Friday. And thanks for today. Shermin, thank you so much for the session.
Thank you, everyone. Ciao.
Bye.